Hi, I'm Denise Lockett, and I'm here to talk about elder abuse. I'm a staff attorney with the Senior Law Project at Legal Aid of North Carolina, and I want to discuss an overview of the types of abuse that affect elders in our nation. There are obviously physical forms of abuse, such as inflicting or threatening to inflict physical pain or injury. There's also deprivation of medical care, food, sustenance. There is emotional abuse, which can be inflicting mental pain, anguish, or distress on an older adult through verbal or nonverbal acts. Sexual abuse is non-consensual sexual contact of any kind, harassment, threats, coercing sexual behavior, and also forcing the victim to witness sexual acts. Exploitation is the unauthorized or improper taking of, use of, or concealment of funds, property, and assets. Neglect is the refusal or failure by those responsible to care for an elder adult to provide food, shelter, health care, or protection when needed. And then finally, abandonment, which is the desertion of a vulnerable elder adult by anyone who has assumed responsibility for the care of that adult. So those are the main forms of abuse that affect older adults in our culture. And some of us may wonder who is committing these acts. And preconceived notion is often that elders are abused by strangers who are opportunistic. However, unfortunately, statistics show that over 60% of abusers are known to the older adult victim. Oftentimes, family members or caregivers who may live in the home with the victim. Scam artists also do affect older adults in terms of finding ways to abuse them. And we'll have another staff attorney talk about those instances in greater detail later. But let's talk further about how we can pick up on these instances of abuse in our culture. What are the signs that we need to look for? So for physical abuse and sexual abuse, signs such as unexplained bruising, burns or blisters, pressure marks, unexplained sexually transmitted diseases, bruising in non-extremity areas such as on the chest or the trunk, changes in toileting habits, and also UTIs and unexplained bleeding in the vaginal area. For neglect, we look for things such as pressure ulcers, which are also known as bed sores, dehydration and malnutrition, changes in behavior that might be related to a lack of regularly prescribed and used medications, and basically withdrawal, a senior turning inward and being less communicative. Also, agitation in the presence of another individual can be a sign that that older adult has been traumatized by that individual. So be on the lookout for that. Emotional abuse can be wide-ranging and difficult to spot, but some of the telltale signs can be these behavioral changes that I've mentioned, and also other changes such as generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, fearfulness, when communicating in front of another person, being guarded. Also using coded wording such as, oh, he doesn't know his own strength, or she tends to fly off the handle. Those could be tip of the iceberg indicators that something further is going on and needs to be explored. For financial abuse, oftentimes you might notice sudden changes in the older adult's finances. You might have bounced checks. You might have large withdrawals. There may be transitions from one account to another. There may be unexplained purchases, things that are not characteristic for that older adult. One other issue that comes up a lot is unauthorized use of a debit card. So if there are charges, for example, lots of different gas station charges, lots of eating out when you know the older adult doesn't eat out frequently or at all. Those are kinds of things to look for to see if that senior is being exploited. One thing that we see sometimes are caregivers who take advantage of the older adult having valuables in the home. If things are starting to go missing, that might also be an indication of financial exploitation. And in general, if there are changes in the older adult's routines that are not well explained, someone who used to be out and about, socially engaged, suddenly becomes withdrawn, is difficult to contact, doesn't seem to be aware of family events, or even not even checking their mail. Things like that may be an indication of abuse or exploitation, and it really does set off a warning bell. So we should have an eye out for things like that and inquire further. There is a nationwide move afoot to incorporate more of these instances of awareness as part of a regular medical checkup. So a family physician, or some may call it a GP, may start inquiring at the older adult's appointment using a simple screening tool. And I have a sample that's called EASI. You might want to look that up on the internet, but it's only 6 questions. And if your doctor's not using it already, I hope they will soon, because it's a good screening tool just to ask every older adult some questions that are just getting to some of the vulnerabilities that older adults have in terms of abuse. And so those questions are, have you relied on people for any of the following? Bathing, shopping, dressing, banking, or meals? Has anyone prevented you from getting food, clothes, medication, glasses, hearing aids, or medical care, or from being with people that you want to be with? Have you been upset because someone talked to you in a way that made you feel ashamed or threatened? Has anyone tried to force you to sign papers or to use your money against your will? Has anyone made you afraid, touched you in ways that you did not want, or hurt you physically? And finally, keyed into the physician's own expertise, there is a cue that says elder abuse can be associated with findings such as poor eye contact, withdrawn nature, malnourishment, hygiene issues, cuts, bruises, inappropriate clothing, or medication compliance issues. Did you notice any of that today? And I think that this kind of assessment tool is something that we'll see in greater use as time goes by. It's akin to some of the domestic violence related questions that you may have been asked in a medical appointment already. And many people have noted that elder abuse and the awareness of it today is kind of where the awareness of domestic violence was in the 70s. So we are really just starting to engage in some greater cultural awareness and response to elder abuse. And that's a good thing. Related to that is the question of who tends to be most vulnerable. Clearly, some of the things that we associate with becoming older can expose us to the possibility of abuse. Isolation is the main factor that creates vulnerability. Also, we should be aware that it doesn't really matter how wealthy you are or what race or ethnicity. you're from, anyone can be a victim. So some of the things we also want to have an awareness of are situations that increase vulnerability, such as diminished eyesight, problems with hearing, motor skills issues, and obviously a lack of transportation, someone who's dependent on others in order to get to appointments or to get to social engagements. Medical issues as well as psychological issues can also greatly enhance the vulnerability of the older adult. And so we look for people who have medication concerns, either over or under medicated, individuals who have dementia, sometimes not yet diagnosed, individuals who might have had lifelong psychological issues that perhaps are not well managed. All of these factors can expose an older adult to abuse and manipulation. Also, once someone has been exposed and become a victim, they often end up trapped in that cycle because they cannot see a way out and because they fear greater loss of control, possibly institutionalization, if they reveal the abuse. You may be familiar with the power and control wheel that domestic violence advocates have used since the 80s to talk about how an abuser manipulates a victim in a domestic violence setting. There's a similar wheel for looking at how older adults are abused. And so I'm going to walk you through that because I think these are factors that we all need to be aware of and to be sensitive to as we're in our own communities trying to look out for the health and well-being of older adults. So first, we were just discussing some of the factors that expose an older adult to abuse, and dependency is one of the key issues that crops up. Some examples of how an abuser can manipulate and take advantage of the dependency of the older adult include the following: taking medical equipment, such as wheelchairs or walkers, glasses or dentures, denying food, care, medicine, or access to medical providers, causing the older adult to miss appointments or switching providers frequently, failure to report medical problems, and also something that I've seen, insisting on sitting in with the older adult in all of the appointments so that the narrative to the doctor or PA is controlled. The second spoke of the wheel is ridiculing the older adult's values. And this gets into emotional abuse. Things like denying access to meaningful religious services or observances, or denying access to religious leaders, making fun of the older adult's values, ignoring cultural traditions that are important to that older adult, any way to degrade that older adult and make them feel more helpless. Another spoke is emotional abuse that includes yelling, insulting, name calling, using profanity when you know that that older adult is upset by that, making the older adult think that he or she is crazy, gaslighting, doing things like moving things around, or questioning the older adult or saying, I never said that, or don't you remember you did this the other day, doing it in a way intended to manipulate and harm. Manipulating family members is yet another spoke, and that can be doing things like magnifying pre-existing family disagreements, gossiping about the older adult, misleading the family about the older adult's mental health and capacity, excluding access to family members, taking away the phone, saying that that older adult's not there when a family member calls, and forcing the older adult to keep secrets from the rest of the family. Related to that is the spoke of isolation, which is, again, controlling. controlling where the older adult goes, when they're allowed out, who they see, who they speak with, limiting access to friends and family. I've seen people insisting on having all of the passwords if the older adult is computer savvy and has access to a computer, taking that away. So doing things to cut off contact and communication with others. Also taking car keys. One more spoke is misuse of the privilege that the abuser has, particularly if the abuser is a caregiver living in the house, eventually treating the older adult like a servant or a degraded individual, gradually gaining more and more control over all of the day-to-day decisions, where food is stored, what food is purchased, when the older adult can even watch TV, those kinds of things, so that the circle becomes smaller and smaller, and the scope of the older adult's control is more and more constricted. Another spoke is financial exploitation, which we've discussed a little bit, but it can be from the smallest of things like stealing small possessions to huge breaches of financial security, invading trusts, taking retirement funds, using the debit card, opening up credit cards in the older adult's name. So abusing the good credit of the older adult. And some of it can be as simple as being given money to spend on one item or for one purpose, such as medication, but using it on the abuser instead. And then obviously there's always the huge issue of abuse of a power of attorney, which many people think of sometimes as a license to steal, and it's not. And there are a lot of legal protections that can be brought to bear as remedies, but it's important to look out for how is that agent under the power of attorney acting. Are they engaged in anything that looks like self-dealing? That should be investigated right away. And then finally, threats and intimidation. That can be threats against the older adult himself or herself, or threats of self-harm. Oh, you know, if you don't do this, I'm going to commit suicide. If you don't do this, I won't talk to you again. If you don't do this, I'm going to have you institutionalized. So those are things that can often be used to control the scope of the older adult's liberty, and it may be coercive enough that the older adult is scared to reach out for help. One final thing I would mention under that kind of control and intimidation is the fact that many older adults have a bonded relationship with a pet, a cat or a dog. Sometimes abusers will threaten to harm that pet, may even harm the pet or threaten to take the pet away if the older adult doesn't comply with the demands that have been made. So those are some things to look at in terms of how abuse may differ from the classic perception of domestic abuse when it's affecting an older adult in our community. And you may wonder, well, how many adults are suffering from this kind of abuse? Nationally, the National Council on Aging and other sources say 1 in 10 older adults has reported abuse. However, we suspect that only 1 in 14 abused older adults ever reports it. So again, this is a tip of the iceberg situation. It's something where we as a community need to have our eyes and ears open and try to make safe spaces for older adults to reveal what may be going on in their own lives. There are traditional options that don't suit the abused older adult very well. Things such as shelter situations, group counseling, domestic violence advocacy models that are more geared towards younger adults and younger adults with children don't necessarily fit this demographic very readily. So we have issues such as mobility issues, issues such as a lack of computer access or fluency, and issues such as the older adult who might be very reluctant to pursue legal remedies against an abuser because they want to maintain some kind of relationship with that abuser. Remember, 60% of the abusers are close to the older adult, and so there may be some sort of need to maintain a relationship, even if it's modified to make the older adult safer. A classic restraining order may not be the perfect fit. So if you are someone who believes you might be aware of an instance of abuse affecting an adult, obviously North Carolina has a mandatory reporter status. That means if you think that an adult is being abused, you're going to need to report that to the Adult Protective Services agency that's serving the county where that adult is found. Now, if you've done that, it is confidential, and typically you'll get notice as to whether or not there was follow-up and it was accepted for investigation. The best thing you can do if you're going to report a situation is to gain as many details safely as possible. Those would be things about what kind of suspected abuse is happening, what indicators you're seeing, some of the things we talked about, such as bruising, changes in behavior, an appearance of malnutrition. Those kinds of things are very meaningful information to share with the intake staff. Then, if you yourself are suffering from abuse, obviously, if it's an emergency, you should call 911. If not, you can reach out to APS. You can also talk with Legal Aid of North Carolina confidentially and safely. You can discuss options such as restraining orders or revocations of powers of attorney if those have been abused. And there are many other options. But the main thing is to seek a safe source of help. Also, your local domestic violence shelter has advocates who can help, and they have confidential hotlines. So those are resources available for the victim. I would also encourage you to think about other resources in the community that might help protect a suspected victim. That might be safe family members, church or synagogue or mosque members who have some kind of connection with that older adult and can help them safety plan and create a community. Further, make sure that the seniors in your life maintain as many strong social connections and networks as possible. That not only helps prevent abuse, but it also helps physical and mental health and longevity. There are a lot of statistics showing that the more connections we have that are quality connections, basically the better our health in the long run. And so this is something that we need to make sure folks are aware of, and that we foster those sustaining and nurturing relationships for our older adults in the community. And finally, if you suspect that someone you know is a victim, in addition to providing information, make sure that if you have the ability to provide a safe and listening ear, a non-judgmental presence for that adult while they're trying to determine what the best path forward is, that you do that, because that is central to helping the person escape this kind of constricting and often humiliating and disempowering set of circumstances. But those are my tips about how to be sensitive to the presence of abuse in our community as it affects older adults, what to look for, how to respond, and what we might do to better take care of the seniors in our lives. Thank you.